Jacob felt a gnawing unease the moment they entered the sprawling penthouse hosting the party. The room was filled with laughter, the chime of glasses, and the murmur of well-dressed colleagues mingling under the glittering chandelier. Susan, his wife of 8 years, clung to his arm as they navigated through the crowd, her smile radiant and infectious. Yet, Jacob couldn't shake off the feeling that tonight would be different. He first noticed it when Susan greeted Nathan, her colleague. Nathan, a tall, confident man with a slick haircut and a sharp suit, exuded the kind of effortless charisma that made people gravitate toward him. Jacob watched as Susan's face lit up the moment she spotted him across the room. "Jacob, you remember Nathan, right?" Susan said, her voice tinged with excitement as she leaned in closer to Nathan than Jacob thought necessary. Jacob extended his hand stiffly. "Of course. Good to see you again." "Likewise," Nathan said, flashing a grin that was a little too self-assured for Jacob's liking. Nathan's hand lingered in the handshake, and Jacob felt a pang of irritation. The evening progressed, but Jacob couldn't ignore the growing tension between him and Susan. She seemed unusually animated as she conversed with Nathan. Her laughter, which Jacob hadn't heard that freely in months, rang out across the room. She placed her hand on Nathan's arm as they spoke, a gesture that felt far too intimate. Jacob stood by the bar, nursing his drink, his mind racing. "Am I imagining things?" he wondered. "Perhaps I'm overreacting." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with every passing moment. Then came the first moment of undeniable humiliation. Susan and Nathan were standing together in a corner, their heads bent close as they spoke in hushed tones. From across the room, Jacob watched them laugh, their faces glowing in the ambient light. He saw Susan gently touch Nathan's shoulder, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second longer than they should have. "Hey, Jacob," a colleague said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Your wife and Nathan seem to be hitting it off." Jacob forced a tight smile. "They work together. They're just catching up." The colleague chuckled. "If you say so." A knot formed in Jacob's stomach. He decided to join the conversation, hoping to dispel his suspicions. As he approached, Susan noticed him and took a step back from Nathan, her expression momentarily startled. "Jacob, Nathan was just telling me about his trip to Italy. Did you know he's been to Florence?" Jacob nodded, forcing a smile. "Sounds fascinating." "It was," Nathan said, his eyes never leaving Susan's face. "I was just telling Susan that the art and culture there reminded me of her. So vibrant and full of life." Jacob clenched his jaw. "Interesting comparison." Susan laughed nervously, brushing her hair back. "Oh, Nathan, you're too much." As the night wore on, the moments of tension and unease piled up. Jacob noticed Nathan subtly guiding Susan towards secluded corners of the room. Their body language grew increasingly relaxed, legs slightly angled toward each other, their voices dropping into intimate tones. At one point, Jacob saw Susan accept a glass of champagne from Nathan, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. Nathan whispered something in her ear, and Susan threw her head back in laughter. Jacob's heart sank as he noticed other guests glancing at the pair, their expressions ranging from amused to pitying. "Jacob, isn't that your wife over there?" a colleague asked with a smirk, gesturing towards Susan and Nathan. Jacob's face burned. "Yes, she's just making conversation." "Looks like more than that to me," the colleague said with a raised eyebrow before walking away. The evening reached its crescendo when the host announced a toast. Everyone gathered in a circle, glasses raised. Jacob found himself standing apart from Susan and Nathan, who were once again side by side. As the host spoke, Jacob couldn't help but notice Nathan leaning close to whisper something into Susan's ear. She smiled and whispered back, her lips almost brushing against his cheek. After the toast, Jacob finally confronted Susan. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his voice tight. Susan looked startled but followed him to a quieter corner. "What's wrong, Jacob? What's wrong?" Jacob repeated, his voice low but edged with anger. "You've spent the entire night with Nathan. People are starting to notice." Susan's brow furrowed. "Notice what?" "We're just talking." "It doesn't look like that from where I'm standing," Jacob said, his frustration boiling over. The laughing, the touching, the whispering. It's humiliating, Susan. Susan's eyes flashed with indignation. You're being ridiculous. Nathan is a colleague. We're friends. That's it. Friends don't act like that, Jacob snapped. Do you have any idea how this looks? Before Susan could respond, Nathan approached, his expression one of concern. Everything okay here? He asked, his tone overly familiar. Jacob turned to him, his anger barely contained. This is a private conversation. Nathan held up his hands defensively. Of course. Just checking in. Susan looked between the two men, her face pale. Let's not make a scene, she said softly. Jacob took a deep breath, realizing that they had indeed become the center of attention. People were watching, whispering behind their glasses. The humiliation was complete. The ride home was silent, the tension between them palpable. Jacob stared out of the window, his mind replaying the events of the evening. Susan sat stiffly beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiance. Jacob knew that tonight had changed something between them, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be undone. The cold January air seeped through the cracks in the car's old insulation as Jacob sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. His knuckles were white, his chest heaving with shallow breaths as the weight of the night pressed down on him. The party was still in full swing, the faint hum of music and laughter filtering through the car's closed windows. He couldn't go back inside. Not after everything he had seen. Susan's laughter echoed in his mind, each peal slicing into him like a shard of glass. He had seen her laugh like that before, years ago, when they were still dating, and everything between them was new and exciting. That kind of laughter wasn't meant for anyone else. It was meant for him, or at least it used to be. The thought made his stomach churn, a bitter cocktail of anger, humiliation, and despair bubbling inside him. He replayed the evening in his head, each moment more damning than the last. Her hand lingering on Nathan's arm, her sparkling eyes locked on his as if no one else in the room mattered. The way Nathan's voice softened when he spoke to her, his words dripping with unspoken promises. And worst of all, the looks from the other guests, pitying, amused, judgmental. He could almost hear their whispers now. Poor Jacob, can't even keep his wife's attention. The humiliation was suffocating. He had felt like a ghost at his own wife's side, reduced to a spectator as she practically paraded her affection for Nathan in front of him. A hot flush crept up Jacob's neck as he thought of Nathan's smirk, that self-assured grin that seemed to mock him at every turn. Unable to stay at the party a second longer, Jacob had slipped out without a word, his coat barely draped over his shoulders. The doorman had given him a puzzled look as he exited, but Jacob didn't care. The walls of the penthouse had felt like they were closing in on him, the laughter and chatter morphing into a deafening roar that he needed to escape. Now, sitting in the darkness of his car, Jacob felt the full weight of his emotions crash over him. He wanted to scream, to cry, to punch the dashboard until his knuckles bled, but all he could do was sit there, staring blankly out at the city lights. How did it get to this? He whispered to no one, his voice breaking. Jacob's mind wandered back to the beginning of their relationship. He remembered how Susan used to look at him, her gaze filled with love and admiration. She used to tell him he was her rock, the one person she could always count on. They had built a life together, a home, shared dreams, a bond that he thought was unshakable. But tonight had shattered that illusion. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. Pulling it out with trembling hands, he saw Susan's name flashing on the screen. For a moment, he considered answering, but the thought of hearing her voice, of her trying to explain or, worse, deny what had happened, made him feel sick. He let the call go to voicemail, then turned off his phone entirely. The quiet returned, but it was anything but peaceful. Jacob's thoughts spiraled into darker territory. He began questioning everything. Had there been signs before tonight? Little moments he had brushed off or ignored. He thought of the times Susan had been late coming home from work, her excuses seeming just a little too rehearsed. The nights she had been glued to her phone, smiling at something on the screen but refusing to share what it was. The idea that there could have been more, that tonight wasn't just an isolated incident but part of a larger betrayal, made Jacob's chest tighten. He felt like he couldn't breathe. "You idiot," he muttered to himself, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. How could you not see it? A memory surfaced unbidden. Susan and Nathan at last year's company retreat. Jacob had dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to workplace camaraderie, but now the memory felt tainted. He remembered the way Susan had laughed at Nathan's jokes, the way they had partnered up for the team-building exercises without hesitation. He had even teased her about it afterward, calling Nathan her work husband. Susan had laughed it off, but now the thought made his skin crawl. Hours passed as Jacob sat in the car, the city outside growing quieter as the night wore on. He didn't know what to do or where to go. The thought of going home to their shared bed, their shared life, felt unbearable. Yet he couldn't stay in the car forever. The cold began to seep into his bones, and Jacob finally started the engine, more for the heater than anything else. As the car warmed up, so did his anger. The humiliation he felt turned into a simmering rage, not just at Susan but at himself. He had allowed this to happen, hadn't he? He had let their relationship become stagnant, had taken her for granted. Or at least that's what he told himself, the self-blame mixing with the anger in a toxic brew. But then another thought struck him. Why should I blame myself for her choices? No matter what shortcomings their marriage might have had, it didn't justify what Susan had done tonight. The thought of her and Nathan, of what might have been said or done when he wasn't looking, made Jacob's blood boil. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. He wanted answers. He wanted to confront Susan, to demand the truth, but the fear of what he might hear held him back. What if she admitted there was something between her and Nathan? What if she didn't? Could he ever believe her again after what he had seen? The humiliation of the evening replayed itself in his mind like a broken record. The looks from the other guests, Nathan's smirk, Susan's laughter, it all felt like a cruel joke at his expense. Jacob's eyes stung as tears threatened to spill over, but he blinked them back, refusing to break down entirely. Eventually, the night began to fade into the pale light of dawn. Jacob hadn't slept, hadn't moved much from his spot in the car. His body ached, and his mind felt raw from hours of overthinking, but he still didn't have any answers. As the city began to stir, Jacob finally put the car in drive, unsure of where he was going. All he knew was that something had to change. He couldn't go on like this, living in the shadow of his own doubts and fears. Whatever came next, whether it was a confrontation, a confession, or something else entirely, Jacob knew he had to face it. The only question was, would he face it alone? Jacob's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway of their apartment building as he approached the door. His body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and the storm of emotions that had battered him all night. He had spent hours trying to sort through his thoughts, but the one thing he couldn't escape was the need for answers. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to demand the truth, to confront Susan about what had happened. When he unlocked the door, the apartment was dark except for the dim glow of a lamp in the living room. Susan was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as Jacob entered, her face pale and drawn. "You're home," she said softly, her voice trembling. Jacob didn't respond. He closed the door behind him, dropped his keys onto the counter with a clatter, and turned to face her. His eyes burned into hers, unrelenting. "Where were you?" Susan asked, her tone cautious. Jacob ignored the question. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. Susan nodded, unfolding herself from the couch. She hesitated for a moment before standing, the blanket slipping off her shoulders. "Jacob, I know you're upset. Please, just let me explain." He gestured sharply for her to continue. "Go ahead. Explain." Susan wrung her hands together, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for the right words. "It wasn't what it looked like," she began, but Jacob cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Not what it looked like. Susan, the entire party saw you with Nathan. Laughing, touching, whispering in corners. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for me?" Susan flinched at his words. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, congratulations. You succeeded," Jacob snapped. Tears welled up in Susan's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Nathan has been flirty with me for a while," she admitted. I didn't think it was serious at first. He's like that with everyone. Charming, confident. I thought it was harmless. Jacob's jaw tightened. And when did it stop being harmless? Susan hesitated, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she said, "A few months ago." Jacob's stomach dropped. "A few months," he repeated, his voice rising. "This has been going on for months, and you didn't think to tell me?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," Susan said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to upset you over nothing." "Nothing?" Jacob's voice cracked with anger. "Susan, I watched you tonight. That wasn't nothing. You were practically draped over him. People were staring, whispering. Do you know how that felt?" Susan's tears finally spilled over. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear, Jacob, it didn't go too far. It was just attention. He gave me attention that I haven't felt in a long time." Jacob staggered back a step as if she had struck him. "Attention?" he echoed, his voice hollow. "Is that what this is about? You weren't getting enough attention from me, so you let Nathan fill the gap?" "It wasn't like that," Susan said quickly. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen. It just did." Jacob's laughter was cold and bitter. "You didn't plan it? That's your excuse?" Susan wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't even realize how far it had gone until tonight." Jacob's chest ached with a mix of anger and despair. "How far did it go, Susan? Because from where I was standing it looked pretty far." Susan hesitated again, and Jacob felt his patience snap. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "All of it?" She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "Nathan flirted with me and I flirted back," she admitted. "It was exciting, Jacob. He made me feel wanted. But it never went beyond that. We never—" "Don't you dare," Jacob interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "Don't you dare try to soften this. You're telling me you let another man flirt with you for months, that you encouraged it, and now you want me to believe it was innocent?" Susan's tears fell faster, but she didn't look away. "I made a mistake," she said. "A terrible mistake. But I didn't sleep with him, Jacob. I didn't cross that line." Jacob's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Oh, so I'm supposed to feel better now? You didn't sleep with him. Great. What about everything else? The emotional affair, the humiliation, the betrayal?" Susan shook her head, her sobs racking her body. "I didn't think it would hurt you like this," she said, her voice barely audible. Jacob's fury boiled over. "You didn't think? Susan, you're my wife. How could you not think this would hurt me? You let another man come between us, and now you're standing here crying, expecting me to what? Forgive you? Forget it ever happened?" Susan reached out to him, but Jacob stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "Don't touch me." Her hand fell back to her side, and she looked at him with pleading eyes. "Jacob, I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just please don't give up on us." Jacob's heart ached at her words, but the pain of her betrayal was still too fresh, too raw. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair as he tried to collect his thoughts. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said quietly, his back still turned to her. "I'm still me," Susan said desperately. "I'm still the woman who loves you, who wants to make this work." Jacob shook his head. "The woman I married wouldn't have done this. She wouldn't have let another man flirt with her for months and then lied to my face about it." Susan's sobs grew quieter, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Jacob turned back to her, his expression cold and distant. "I need time to think," he said. Susan nodded, her face crumpling with fresh tears. "Take all the time you need," she said. Without another word, Jacob grabbed his coat and walked out the door, leaving Susan alone in the apartment. As he descended the stairs, he felt a hollow ache in his chest, knowing that no matter what happened next, things between them would never be the same. The weight of his decisions sat heavily on Jacob's chest as he walked into the apartment for what he knew would be the final time. The evening air outside had been biting, but the cold that gripped him came from within. Every step he took towards Susan felt like dragging a boulder uphill. Yet he had made up his mind. This was the only way forward. The apartment was eerily quiet. Susan was seated at the dining table, a cup of tea in her hands, her face etched with the toll of the last few days. Her eyes, rimmed with redness and puffiness from endless crying, flicked up to meet his as he entered. "You're home," she said softly, her voice filled with tentative hope. Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind him with deliberate finality, as if shutting out the world beyond. He took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. "We need to talk," he said, his tone flat. Susan set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "Of course," she said, her voice barely audible. "Jacob, I've been thinking a lot. I know I've hurt you and I—" "Stop," Jacob interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've heard everything you needed to say. I've thought about this, about us. And I've made my decision." Susan's face crumpled, panic flashing in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Please, Jacob. Just hear me out one more time." Jacob's expression remained resolute. "There's nothing left to hear, Susan. You betrayed me. You humiliated me. And you expect me to just move past it like nothing happened? I'm not asking you to forget," she said desperately, rising from her seat. "I know what I did was wrong. I've been selfish and I let things get out of hand. But I love you, Jacob. I love us. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Her words hung in the air, but Jacob shook his head, the sadness in his eyes mixing with anger. "It's too late for that," he said. "You made a choice, Susan. You chose to entertain Nathan's attention, to let him worm his way between us. Do you even understand what you've done to me? To us?" Susan stepped closer to him, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "I understand, Jacob. I understand now, and I'm willing to fight for us. Please don't let one mistake destroy everything we've built together." Jacob's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "One mistake? This wasn't one mistake, Susan. It was months of deception. Months of you enjoying his attention while I sat at home like a fool, trusting you." Her tears spilled over again, her voice breaking. "It wasn't about him. It was about me. I was lonely, Jacob. I felt invisible, like you didn't see me anymore. And when Nathan started paying attention to me, it was like I mattered again." "Don't you dare put this on me," Jacob snapped, his voice sharp. "Don't you dare make this about what I didn't do. I was here, Susan. I was committed. I was your husband. And you—" He paused, his voice trembling with emotion. "You threw it all away for a man who saw you as a game." Susan flinched at his words, but Jacob didn't stop. The anger and humiliation he had been bottling up for days poured out in a torrent. "Do you know what it was like for me at that party? Watching you with him? Seeing the way people looked at me, like I was some pathetic, clueless idiot who couldn't keep his wife's attention? Do you even care about what that did to me?" "I do care," Susan cried. "I care more than you know. And I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm so sorry. Please, just give me a chance to prove it to you." Jacob shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No," he said firmly. "I can't do this anymore. I can't live with this betrayal hanging over us. Every time I look at you, I'll see Nathan. I'll see the way you laughed with him, the way you touched him. I'll see the way you didn't care about me." Susan sank to her knees, sobbing openly now. "Don't do this, Jacob. Please. We can fix this. I can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll quit my job. I'll never speak to Nathan again. Just please don't leave me." The sight of her on the floor, broken and begging, should have softened Jacob's heart, but it only deepened the ache inside him. He had loved Susan with everything he had, but the trust between them was shattered, and no amount of pleading could piece it back together. "This isn't just about Nathan," Jacob said quietly. "It's about us. About what we had. And I can't get that back, Susan. I can't unsee what I saw or unknow what I know. I deserve better than this. I deserve someone who respects me enough not to betray me." Susan's sobs filled the room as Jacob turned and walked toward their bedroom. He grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began throwing clothes into it, his movements mechanical. Susan followed him, her pleas growing more frantic. "Don't go," she begged, clutching at his arm. "We can get through this, Jacob. I know we can. Jacob pulled his arm free, his face hard. You made your choice, Susan. Now I'm making mine. As he zipped up the suitcase and carried it toward the door, Susan stood in his path, her body trembling. If you walk out that door, Jacob, it's over. There's no coming back. He met her gaze, his own filled with a mixture of pain and determination. It's already over, he said softly. With that, he stepped past her and out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him. The finality of the sound echoed in his ears, but Jacob felt a strange sense of relief. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but at least now he was free to start over. As he walked toward his car, he didn't look back. He couldn't. The life he had known with Susan was gone, and all that remained was the long road ahead. Jacob's first morning in the small, one-bedroom apartment felt hollow. The silence pressed in around him, unrelenting and suffocating. The echoes of his previous life, his home with Susan, the laughter they once shared, the love he thought was unshakable, clung to him like a second skin. His suitcase sat half unpacked in the corner, and the mattress he had hastily purchased was still bare, the sheets crumpled in their packaging. Sitting at the makeshift desk he'd cobbled together from a thrift store find, Jacob stared at his laptop screen, his mind blank. Work had always been his refuge, but even now, focusing on the lines of code felt impossible. Every few minutes, his thoughts strayed to Susan. Was she thinking about him? Did she regret what she had done? Or was she already moving on, finding solace in Nathan's arms? The thought made his stomach churn, a sharp pang of humiliation lancing through him. The divorce papers hadn't even been finalized, and yet he couldn't shake the image of Susan and Nathan together, laughing at his expense. He tried to push it away, but it haunted him, especially at night when the loneliness became unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob forced himself into a routine. He threw himself into his work, staying late at the office and volunteering for projects he normally would have avoided. His colleagues noticed the change, some offering kind words while others whispered behind his back. He could hear the pity in their voices, the unspoken poor guy, his wife left him. Jacob's humiliation deepened during a meeting one afternoon when a colleague made an offhand comment about Susan. I saw your ex at the company event last week, the man said casually, unaware of the knife he was twisting. She looked happy. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he nodded, saying nothing. The truth was, he hadn't expected her to grieve their marriage the way he had. Susan had always been adept at moving on, compartmentalizing her feelings while Jacob struggled under the weight of his own. One evening, after another sleepless night filled with restless pacing and unanswered questions, Jacob finally admitted he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to a therapist, a recommendation from a colleague who had noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the way he barely spoke during lunch breaks. The first session felt like ripping open an old wound. Jacob sat stiffly in the therapist's office, the faint scent of lavender in the air, and recounted everything. The party, Susan's betrayal, the night spent in his car, and the crushing weight of his decision to leave. I feel like I failed, he confessed, his voice cracking. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I could have stopped it. The therapist, a calm and attentive woman named Dr. Hensley, tilted her head thoughtfully. It sounds like you're blaming yourself for Susan's choices, she said. Do you think that's fair? Her words struck a chord. Jacob had spent months replaying every argument, every moment of neglect, every time he'd come home late from work and collapsed onto the couch without asking Susan about her day. He had carried the blame for her infidelity like a badge of shame, but now, for the first time, he began to see it differently. Therapy became a cornerstone of Jacob's recovery. Session by session, he unpacked the layers of guilt and anger that had consumed him. Dr. Hensley encouraged him to find outlets for his emotions, to rediscover the parts of himself he had lost in the chaos of his marriage. That's when Jacob returned to his old passion, software development for charitable causes. Years ago, before his marriage, he had spent countless hours building programs to help local nonprofits manage their resources more efficiently. It had been a labor of love, something that made him feel connected to a purpose greater than himself. Sitting at his desk one night, Jacob dusted off an old project, a database for a food bank that had fallen by the wayside when his career took precedence. As his fingers flew over the keyboard, writing lines of code, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. The work became his sanctuary. He reached out to the food bank, offering to finish the project and implement it free of charge. Word spread, and soon other organizations began contacting him, eager for his expertise. Jacob's evenings and weekends filled with purpose as he dedicated himself to causes that made a tangible difference in people's lives. The humiliation he had carried from Susan's betrayal didn't vanish overnight, but it began to lose its grip on him. He saw Nathan and Susan less as looming figures in his mind and more as shadows of a past life, painful, yes, but no longer defining. One evening, as Jacob wrapped up a call with a nonprofit director who wanted to expand his program nationwide, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. His work was making an impact, his therapy sessions had helped him rebuild his confidence, and the apartment he once viewed as a symbol of failure had become a haven. He even found himself reconnecting with old friends, people he had drifted away from during his marriage. They welcomed him back without judgment, pulling him into dinners, game nights, and weekend hikes that reminded him of the joy of human connection. One night, Jacob sat at his desk, staring at a photo he had taken of one of his finished projects, a sleek, intuitive interface for a homeless shelter tracking system. His chest swelled with a quiet pride. This was his life now, a life he had built with his own two hands, piece by piece, after everything had fallen apart. The wounds Susan had left were still there, faint scars that reminded him of the pain he had endured. But they no longer defined him. Jacob had found himself again, not as the man who had been betrayed, but as the man who had risen from it, stronger and more fulfilled than he had ever thought possible.